Welcome to Matters of DeCorum. I'm Scott Corum. This is what matters to me, and good evening, my children of the night. It's time to talk about vampires. I have seen just about every proper vampire movie ever made. Yeah, I qualify that for a reason. I'm not going to get into an internet debate here, but yeah, there are such things as improper vampire movies. They may involve sparkles, but maybe that's just me. I have been familiar with the character of Dracula for almost as long as I have been absorbing media. Scooby-Doo and all the cartoons of my childhood, Saturday morning and in the afternoons, vampires were always a presence. Dracula was often a presence. The most used and present character in all of media. Go figure. Dracula movies, Dracula television series, vampire appearances in comic books and novels, and I didn't read Bram Stoker's Dracula until I got to college, but I didn't just read it, I read it academically, studied it. I may have seen some adult movies that feature vampires prominently. Those are always interesting. I have a more than passing association with and knowledge of vampirism, that which is vampiric. Vampires. There's a lot of different varieties of vampire out there, and I've looked at a lot of them. It started with cartoons. Gilligan had a dream where he was Count Dracula once. That was fascinating. Growing up in the 70s with and 80s with that bombardment of every cultural thing ever that came out during that time, it'd be amazing if I didn't have a vampire consciousness. Of course, that also brings up the presence of vampires in role-playing games. I have seen vampires treated very well in role-playing games. I've seen them brought in as villains. I've seen them as allies and patrons. Dungeons and Dragons vampires were terrifying. There was never an edition of D&D where vampires were not terrifying. Vampires in GURPS, just amazingly powerful and frightening, and made really interesting NPC villains and or allies, depending on how the party played their cards. And then, of course, you can't really discuss vampires in role-playing games without bringing up White Wolf's amazing vampire role-playing game. Vampire the Requiem. That opened up whole new worlds of knowledge about vampires and cultural awareness of vampires, and the vampire as a player character really came into its heyday with the White Wolf game. I was a mage player. I was never that into the concept of vampires through there and werewolves. I've read the books. I own them. They're up there. The 4th edition, I really dug into the lore until they severely disappointed me with mage, but I'm a mage player, so that didn't happen. Which meant it was only a matter of time before I took a swing at presenting vampires myself. you get a personal mythos of vampires. You start thinking of why vampires function the way they do. And as a game designer, that is mostly because people are going to ask. You can't just throw down a set of stats and say, boom, vampire, run with it. Because there are questions. When I write a supplement, when I write anything game related, I don't want someone to pick up that book and say, I don't have what I need to use this material. This is interesting, but it only gives me a start. I need answers. I need something more. Vampires. If you're going to play a vampire character, you need to know where that character is coming from. There's a lot of other history. When did you get turned into a vampire? Or where do you come from? What were you before you were a vampire? What other abilities do you have? What do you value? These are all really important questions, but all of these kind of start to fall to the wayside if you don't know what it means to be a vampire and why are there vampires. The background cosmology of the default settings or the victory system is a polytheistic background. There are many gods. There is a sense of deity, but it is not a it's not based on a monotheistic model. There are plenty of gods to go around, and when you have that, when you're not basing your cosmology on a strictly Judeo-Christian model, you get very interesting interactions between that and your vampire mythos. Because I gotta look at what culture and literature has as far as what people expect from vampires and present it in a meaningful way. Vampires shy away from the cross. They resist holy places. They can't bear to have their grave consecrated. Certain aspects of the vampire's existence, their resistance to their vulnerabilities to sunlight, and in some cases other things like pure silver and whatnot are generally relegated back to a Judeo-Christian basis. Vampires fear the cross. Why? In a polytheistic environment, how do I justify that? That was kind of one of the big things. The rest of it, okay. You can come up with all kinds of reason and meaning behind the various weaknesses and powers of the vampire. There are people with allergies to garlic and sunlight. I was allergic to sunlight for a summer. That was terrible. Vitamin D. Breakout and rash whenever I got enough sun to start generating it in my body. My co-author, I shouldn't be sharing too much about his secret vulnerabilities in case anyone ever tries to, stop him from being a superhero, but allergic to garlic. It's always... when Vic is around, you've got to be careful about producing food that has garlic or is even contaminated by garlic. So you can talk about actual biological deficiencies or difficulties, but then vampires become a lot less mysterious. You can't just make them all science. And when you make them all science, that aversion to the cross becomes a psychological thing, and that's really hard to convey as far as retroviruses and whatnot. Nah, it had to be mystical. It had to be cosmological. Vampires are important, and you've got to wonder why there's a reason for that. In Vampiric Victory, just released and now available on RPG Now, follow the link down below if you'd like a copy. Helios is one of the major gods. There's definitely a hierarchy of gods. I had a long discussion over the weekend on Discord with one of my patrons over the nature of the cosmology and the hierarchy. And it's not like you can put the gods in boxes on individual shelves and rank them. There is overlap and flow, and as soon as you can put gods in boxes, they're not really gods anymore. But Helios being one of the primary movers and shakers, god of the sun, vampires are the result of a divine curse. Those who have cursed the sun itself may in turn find themselves cursed by the sun. Or how Helios, the god of the sun, says, fuck me, no, fuck you. They're shunned from the light of the sun. Darkness is their only refuge. They can't bear that which is touched or blessed by a god. There's Disciples of the Blade, back in Hot Chicks, still one of the best books I've written because it includes a lot of the cosmology. Talks about, has the merit favor of the gods. There's another book coming out pretty soon, Alternate Victory 2. It's going to have a very complete list of the merits and flaws in the victory system, which will include favor of the gods. A character who is favored by the gods has their attention. Such a character can bless something just because that character is favored by a particular god in the cosmological pantheon of the universe of Destiny 2025. Doesn't mean that they can't be Christian or hold those values or value Christian items. There are priests who are favored by the god, pastors, ministers, who, upon holding a cross, can focus the power of their faith and their connection to the gods through it, or who can bless such an item, and that blessing will carry the touch of the god. Well, because vampires are the result of a divine curse, they can't bear that blessing, that hint and mote of the actual divine which curses them, locked into an item or consecrated onto a ground. It hurts. It's painful for them to endure. Can't murder a vampire by pressing a cross up against it, but you can freak it the hell out. Give it a really horrible case of the heebie-jeebies. It will have to leave. It repulses their nature. Stakes to the heart. Well, Gaia is related to Helios. Gaia is the daughter of Helios, in as much as those kinds of relationships actually matter. It's not like the gods give physical birth. But she also conveys a bit of that curse. Oh, you're cursed by my father? Well, here, certain herbs are going to carry that curse. Garlic, for instance, and wood. Wood will end you. It'll have to be, it's not my curse, it's my father's curse. So the wood has to be applied in a very specific way. Say, hammered into your heart. That organ's still important to you, so yeah. It's a process of figuring out exactly what makes a vampire tick, or untick, as they are the living dead. And you gotta think about what that means, too. Vampiric metabolism, and And what that means as far as cellular respiration, are they producing ATP? How are they processing blood? Is that just a metaphysical thing that they're taking in when they drink blood? Or they actually have some kind of metametabolism that operates alongside the natural processes that are no longer functioning because they're vampires? Back in the original Hot Chicks book, Vic designed the fledgling vampire, and we've had vampires in the system from pretty much the beginning, but we never did anything with them. I've had vampire villains, but they were always stuff off the top of my head. I never really defined one. I haven't written a vampire villain. I've written vampire adjacent villains. I've written villains that mimicked vampirism or who affected themselves as vampires, but were not really in and of themselves vampires. Didn't stop me from talking about there being vast vampire conspiracies in the background, and organizations and communities of vampires that would react to things, but I never defined them. They were always a mysterious, shadowy force in the background. Well, back in 2016, while I was deep in the throes of fentanyl, like 5 or 6 books jumped into my head that had to be written, and I worked on them. You're never going to see most of that work, because I thought I was being really brilliant over and over again, and fentanyl is a powerful drug, and combine that with oxycodone, because I was in a lot of pain and my doctors didn't think I was going to make it, so I could have as much medication as I wanted. I started a vampires book. Then I tore it all down and started over again. That's what comes out today. The fledgling vampire was a really good start. There were things that could be better defined. There are a lot of new flaws and some new merits in the vampires book. Because there's stuff that I've been using a longhand form for. There have been characters that have a weakness to sunlight, but it's always been a branch of the physical limitation flaw, and needed a weakness to sunlight, and a varying degree of weakness to sunlight needed to be its own thing. So there's the solar bane flaw, which you can take at various levels, each level defining how bad the radiation from the sun affects you as a higher order of radiation. Very powerful vampires have more solar bane and are more vulnerable to it. The greater your vampiric ability, the greater the curse is ingrained into your being. The more the divine shuns you. And I wrote Vampiric Victory not just with an eye towards vampiric villains. The moment you have something like vampires in a role-playing game, the moment those show up, the next question out of your players' mouths is, can I play a vampire? There's an appeal to vampires as your character. I'm running a game for specifically for my patrons online using Discord. And during the character creation process, of course, there was can I play a vampire? And I had just written a section in Vampiric Victory for, what if your players say, can I play a vampire? The next section in that is, can I play a Dompire, or half vampire, Vampire Hunter D style? And of course, the next question out of the player's mouth was, what can I play a Dampire? A good character, something that lets you explore your play, the character's existence, and their relationship to the world, is a combination of strengths and weaknesses. Character weaknesses do not make a bad character. Character weaknesses can define a character. Vampires show up on the stage, stepping out of the shower. They have a ready set made of strengths and weaknesses that are custom made for players to plumb. Well, your character cannot go out in the sunlight. Other characters can. How are you getting around that? Everyone else might need to get stuff done during the day. You're probably going to be sleeping someplace really, really dark during that time. How are you going to get around that? The characters over there are walking into a church to do a deal. You really don't want to go in there. At the same time, a firefight starts, the vampire's laughing most of it off. You've got a really powerful person that you need to get past. The vampire can stare them in the eye and compel them to obedience. Then again, vampires got to eat someone every so often. Well, you can feed off of people and leave them perfectly alive, but they need to drink the blood of sentient beings. It squicks some people. Leads to legal problems. Things like that. You play a player character vampire and you have a pocket full of stuff you have to deal with, along with another pocket full of stuff that makes you awesome to play. And then, of course, you can start answering other questions. Well, what else motivates this character? Yeah, they're a vampire, but that's not everything about them. They were something before. They have other drives and goals and desires. And what makes this character happy? What makes this character sad? What connections does this character have to their old life? What connections have they forged in their new vampiric existence? So I don't discourage people from playing vampires. I warn them, look, this isn't easy. It should not be easy to play a vampire. It should not be a base level 101 role-playing event to have a vampire player character. You have to keep track of things more carefully than other people. Some people don't really want that in their role-playing game. They just want their simple pick it up and go. Some people want a little bit more of a challenge. And for those people, vampires, not a bad choice. Not all the time, maybe, but vampires can be fun. The vampire is a player character. The vampire is a villain. Vampires make wonderful villains. Being the product of a divine curse, having an aversion to that which most people consider good and proper and natural, the sun, for God's sake, they have that cultural air of darkness, of gothic mystery. They are ageless and timeless and come out of the past with resources and strange abilities and power, and they're surrounded in blood and influence. Yeah, that's a bad guy. That can be a wonderful villain. It can be played badly, but a vampire who just steps out as a vampire, I'm a vampire, is going to present something of a challenge. A vampire who has stepped forward, I am immortal, I have a lot of time on my hands, I think I'm going to spend a couple of decades learning Kung Fu. That's a rough vampire to beat. That's a vampire you got to decide, is their agenda so bad that I have to kill him, or can I maybe, get some lessons in first? Vampires make good allies. Vampires can be great patrons. You just have to ask yourself, is it worth the cost? Vampires have enemies. Universally, vampires have enemies. There are people who will kill vampires just for the sake of killing vampires. That's a vampire. It's a dark, evil, horrible thing. I need to take it out. Which is a wonderful ally to have if a vampire is your enemy, and a terrible enemy to have if a vampire is your player character. I love vampires. I've seen them treated so well in role-playing games. I've seen them treated badly. I've seen them treated really well and really badly at the same time. I'm looking at you, Rifts Vampire Kingdoms. I like vampires in Rifts, and I hate vampires in Rifts. They are amazingly powerful and horrible, and if you've got a squirt gun or a properly made spotlight with a cross taped to the lens, they're easy enough to cope with. But it was well past time that I had some vampires of my very own. My patrons get a copy of this book pretty much, well, before this video comes out. And as I said before, my patrons are also invited occasionally to participate in games that I run online. Just a couple of extra perks of being a patron. Think about it. That being said, I'm pretty proud of this one. It worked out better than I thought. It will lay a foundation for a bunch of books to come. Now I just need to finish Mecha. I need to come up with some small format books to do in the meantime. Yeah, that means writing books while I'm writing books, so I can write books to write books about. And once Mecha is out, then it's time for Destiny. Destiny 2025 is going to be a really big project. It's going to take the world of hot chicks from 2015 and make it into something bigger, far-reaching, advance it by its decade, and give people a chance to dance in the world. It's going to be a hard project to do, but I'll talk about that in another one. That may end up being a Kickstarter. That may very well end up being a Kickstarter towards the end of the year, if I am lucky and able to continue to produce at the rate that I've gotten to. Wish me luck. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Again, link to the Vampiric Victory product page at RPG Now will be below the video. Think about it. It's a good book. And maybe buy some of my other stuff while I'm there. If you liked the video, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't like the video, give me a thumbs down. Feedback is feedback. If you'd like me to talk about anything specifically or have your own experiences and commentary about vampires or the vampiric nature, leave me a comment. I love getting comments. You'll love leaving me a comment. If you'd like to see these videos as soon as they come out, and why wouldn't you? They're awesome. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you do hit the subscribe button, hit the little notification bell next to it so that you get the notification as soon as these videos are released. If you'd like to really help out and maybe get a couple of the extra perks, feel free to hit me up at my Patreon page, www.patreon.com, and consider donating. Absolutely anything helps and allows me to make better videos more often. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. I am Scott Corum. This is what has mattered to me, and I will see you next time on the next Matters of DeCorum.